Good morning. If you would please turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2 will be our text this morning. I want to talk with you this morning for a few minutes about the Christmas story. Typically, what happens with the Christmas story is we take parts of the story from Matthew, we take parts of the story from Luke, and we mash it together. Okay, we add to that a bunch of traditions that have accumulated through the centuries. We wrap that up in childhood sentimentality, and sometimes what we end up with is a story that's really cute, but maybe it's not entirely real. Okay, suddenly the shepherds and angels and wise men all follow a star in the east to Bethlehem, where they witness Mary giving birth to Jesus in a barn while the camels and donkeys sing Silent Night. Okay, over in the corner, the kids decorate the Christmas tree, a bell rings and an angel gets its wings. At the very end of it all, Tiny Tim proclaims, "God bless us, everyone." Okay. And that's the Christmas story, right? Okay, now this morning I'm not some bah humbug who wants to ruin the experience of your nativity scene. Okay, if you go to your nephew's Christmas play later, don't be that person who says, "Well, Jesus wasn't really born on December 25th, and that's not how it really happened. My preacher says," okay, don't do that. Don't be that person. Please appreciate the spirit in which people seek to honor the birth of Jesus. Please appreciate the general goodness that goes into those nativity productions. All right, my concern this morning is that sometimes we get so caught up in the sentimentality of this story. Sometimes we've made such a romanticized version of the Christmas story that we might miss what Matthew or Luke is really trying to do with the birth of Jesus story. Okay, because the way the Gospels portray this story are very different. Right? If you turn over to the Gospel of Luke and you read about this story, it emphasizes Jesus' humble origin. Okay, in Luke, we read about Jesus, the baby in the manger. In Luke, we read about the shepherds coming to see Jesus. In Luke, Jesus is presented by his parents at the temple. It's the humble people at the temple who recognize the significance of this small boy. Okay, all these stories in Luke are focused on making the same point. Luke desperately wants us as his readers to understand that Jesus came to raise up the humble. Jesus came for the poor. Jesus came for a people who were desperately needing a Savior. Okay, Luke emphasizes the humble humanity of Jesus. Right? But we're in Matthew this morning, and Matthew's completely different. Right? If in Luke we get away in a manger, Matthew is where we get joy to the world. In Matthew, we don't read about mangers. We don't read about shepherds. We don't read about any of that humility for Jesus. Matthew has a different point. Instead, in Matthew, we start off in chapter 1 showing that Jesus has a birthright to be king. We talked about this last week, right? Jesus is a descendant of David. Jesus has a right to sit on the throne of Israel as king. This week, we move on in our story in Matthew to the story of the Magi and King Herod. Again, I think both of these characters are showing us something of what it means for Jesus to be king. Okay, notice our text this morning, Matthew 2, starting in verse 1. It says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.' When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. 'In Bethlehem in Judea,' they replied, 'for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him.' After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Right, I'm hoping this morning that that's not the first time you've heard this story. I think most of us probably grew up with the legend of we three kings from the Orient who rode their camels across the desert to bring gifts to Jesus. I've got a really cute Fisher-Price nativity set at my house with these three little wise men each holding their little gifts to present to the baby Jesus. And most of us grew up hearing the story of brutal King Herod, right? It's not hard to know as we read this text who the villain is in our story. And I think that with both the wise men and Herod, we see something of what it means for Jesus to be king. I think all of the characters in these early stories in Matthew focus on the kingship of Jesus. Okay, again, we started with a genealogy proclaiming that Jesus is king. The very next story is this one, the story of the Magi or the kingmakers and their interaction with the man who claims to be king. Okay, the whole dialogue takes place between them and the man sitting on the throne over Judea, King Herod. Everything in these stories focuses on kingship, and yet the different characters in our story all approach kingship very differently. Okay, so what do we do with this? What are we supposed to learn from this story? I want us to focus first on King Herod, because I think King Herod portrays to us in graphic detail that the foolish want to be king. Okay, the foolish want to be king. You know, when I was a kid, I remember sometimes my mom would take us to Burger King. I don't know if they do this still, but when I was a kid, you used to get a paper crown when you went to Burger King. Anyone remember putting a paper crown on your head? Okay, some of you had real childhoods and you did this. All right, and you would go in and you'd get that paper crown and you would put it on your head and you would imagine what it would be like to be king. Right? What did you dream about when you put that crown on your head? What was your fantasy of what it would be like if you were in charge of the world? Okay, if you were the boss, what would happen? Okay, first off, if I was king, I would have banned my sisters from the kingdom, right? That's the first thing. That's pretty easy. Bedtime would be abolished. I'd play all the Nintendo I wanted. Okay, I had grand plans for my kingship. You know, as an adult, sometimes we still wonder what it would be like to be king. Okay, if I was king, you would all have to respect me. Okay, and you could still call me David. Not everyone would have to call me your majesty. I mean, my wife would have to call me your majesty. The elders would have to call me your majesty. Actually, you would all have to call me your majesty. Okay, the Texas Longhorns would never play football again if I was king. We'd just get away with that. Okay, I would drive something nicer than a 13-year-old Nissan Sentra, right? I could get used to the idea of being king. You know, part of our human nature is that we desire power. Okay, we lust after power. We want to be in charge. Okay, nobody likes anyone else telling them what to do. You don't want to have a boss, you want to be the boss. Okay, our constant struggle, fundamentally at our core, what separates us from God is our desire to be our own Lord and Master. I want to be in charge of my life. I don't want to have to answer to anybody else. I want to do what I want to do. At my core, I am selfish. Okay, and when we look at King Herod in the Gospel of Matthew, though, we see what that kind of life leads to. We see that it is the desire of a fool to grab all of the power that he can. Okay, we'll talk more about the Magi in a minute. But as soon as King Herod heard that the Magi were in town looking for a new king, that they showed up and said, "Okay, king, where is the new king?" The text says that Herod was disturbed. Okay, that's putting it rather mildly. When they showed up and said, "Where is the new king of Judea?" Herod panicked. Herod was terrified. This is a threat to his precious power, his throne, and Herod desired control above anything else in his life. He would do anything to keep his power, to keep his control. Okay, in fact, he had a reputation for this. Throughout the Roman Empire, Herod was notorious for quelling threats to his throne by whatever means possible. He spent his entire life paranoid that someone was going to take away his power. Okay, the first person that he killed, who he thought was conspiring against him, was his favorite wife, Miriam. Okay, he had her put to death because he got it in his head that there was a plot that she was hatching to take over his throne. Shortly after that, he had her mother, Alexandra, killed because he thought she was in on it. Shortly after that, he had his eldest son, Antipater, killed, thinking that their son was the one plotting to truly take his throne. Later on, he had two more of his sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, killed, thinking they're in on it too. They're trying to take my throne away from me. Okay, the tragic part about this is that there's no evidence that any of these people were ever actually plotting against him. This was all just in his own mind. When the emperor in Rome, Caesar Augustus, heard about all of King Herod's executions, he made a very famous statement that stuck with us throughout history. Okay, he said that in Judea it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. Herod was a paranoid ruler, and he was a monster. He even famously decreed that when he died, he wanted all of the leading officials throughout Jerusalem to be executed on the day of his death because he wanted there to be mourning in the city, and he knew he was hated, and so the only way he could make the city mourn was to execute a bunch of other people. This guy was a monster. He was hated, he was feared, and his desire to be in control and to be king ultimately caused him to lose everything. Okay, and again, one of the reasons Herod's life is so tragic is because it didn't have to be that way, right? He didn't have these big threats to his power. Also, historically, Herod was one of the greatest builders the ancient world had ever seen. Okay, Herod built the temple. He built great city works. He even built the great fortress at Masada, where Israeli soldiers to this day still take their oath. He could have gone down in history as one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world, and yet he's not remembered for any of those things. You go ask a kid on the street today, what do you know about King Herod? And they'll say, oh, he was the bad man that wanted to kill all the babies. He felt threatened, and he needed to be king. Okay, Herod shows us that the foolish want to be king. In fact, I think in Herod we see a common reaction from the world to Jesus. And I'm afraid sometimes it's a reaction that you and I have to Jesus. And that is, we really can't stand him because he interferes in the way we want to live our lives. Because if Jesus is really king, then I'm not king. And again, at my core, I'm pretty selfish and I like being in charge. I want to do things my way. I want to be the one in control. I want to be the one in power. And yet over and over again in Scripture, we see characters like Herod who keep trying to do things their own way, and they always end up doing life poorly. I think the first thing we have to realize as Christians examining the Jesus story is that we can't handle being king. And until we give up that control, until we quit trying to be in charge, we'll never truly understand the Prince of Peace. All right, Herod's not the only character in our story, though. We also see the wise men, right? And the wise men show us a different way of responding to Jesus. Okay, the wise men show us that Jesus is king. Okay, the wise know that Jesus is king. You know, the Magi were part of the Persian Empire. Okay, the Persians lived sort of on the eastern end of the Roman Empire. And even though in the days of Jesus the Romans controlled the world, they never completely conquered the Persian Empire. There are always still remnants of the old Persian power in the east. And so the Magi were part of these people. And in Jesus' day, they were a priestly tribe of the Persians. And one of their roles as priests is that the Magi would make. Okay, every royal court throughout the world had Persians, Magi, who served in their court as royal advisors to the king. Right, if you go back in your Old Testament, look at the book of Daniel, right, you can see Magi who would have been in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and all those Babylonian kings serving in this capacity. They were the royal advisors. Okay, they were experts in astrology and medicine, philosophy, all the natural sciences. Okay, and part of the job of the Magi is they would raise up princes to be kings. They were just part of the tutors. Okay, another thing that the Magi did is when the old king died, typically it was the Magi who were there to help crown the new king. Okay, these guys were not kings themselves like the song says. They were king makers. So imagine if you're king like Herod is over Judea, suddenly a group of king makers knocks on your door and says, "Where's the new king that we're here to crown?" Okay, also, these are not three little old men riding quietly into town on camels like we see in all the little nativity scenes. Okay, these are very powerful men. They traveled in large groups. Undoubtedly, there would have been more than three of them. They would have had a retinue of servants and soldiers that went everywhere with them. When they came into Jerusalem, they came not on camels, they came on fine Persian horses. There would have been a huge group of them that came into the city, went to Herod's palace and said, "We're here to see the new king, where is he?" Everybody in Jerusalem knew when the Magi came to town. And so they go to Herod, they ask him about this new king. Herod pretends piety, right? He says, "Oh, please, show me where this king is. I would love to go and worship him too." So the Magi leave Herod. The star leads them to Jesus. And when they get to Mary and Joseph, they give them three gifts that are more extravagant than anything middle-class people in Judea would have ever seen in their lives. And I think Matthew gives us these three gifts and tells us what they are for a reason. Okay, gold obviously carries royal symbolism. Okay, gold is a gift for a king. Frankincense is an aromatic substance. In Jesus' day, it was typically used in temples. This is part of the incense that priests offered at temples. If gold is a gift for a king, frankincense is a gift for a priest. The last gift is really the strangest one, the gift of myrrh. Okay, the best known use for myrrh in the ancient world is it was used as a spice for embalming wealthy people. Okay, I think it's intentional that Matthew says the three gifts of Jesus are gifts fit for a king, fit for a priest, and fit for one who is to die. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay, and this is not a normal birth. The Magi recognize that here is a king worthy of kingly gifts, and not only that, but they worship him. Okay, you don't worship kings, you worship deity. Finally, in Jesus, we have the one the prophecies point to. This is the one that they have been waiting for. They recognize that Jesus is king. If you read the rest of the Gospel of Matthew, you see that commonly there are two responses to Jesus. When people meet Jesus as he goes throughout his ministry, either they will recognize, here is the one meant to be Lord, or they will oppose him with everything that's inside of them because they want to be king. There's only two responses in your life to Jesus. Either you can be a fool and claim to be king of your own life, or you can have wisdom and recognize that Jesus is king. And I think one of the ways that you can tell which choice you've made in your own life is to examine very specific areas of your life and ask, have I really made Jesus king? If you look at your finances, are you king or is Jesus king? If you look at the way you relate to people around you, are you king or is Jesus king? Look at the way you spend your free time in serving other people. Are you king or is Jesus king? Because the ultimate point of the Gospel of Matthew is that the only way you will ever find any sort of contentment in life, the only way you will ever find meaning in life, is if you will make Jesus king.